June 22, 1775. Philadelphia. Charles Thomson records the vote. Congress authorizes $2 million. A war has begun. A nation has not. The money arrives before the machinery to honor it exists. 5 years later, Congress will mark the paper down at 40-1. This is not fiction. This was Philadelphia, 1775. That is the whole tragedy in miniature. The paper came first. The state did not. On that day, the Continental Congress resolved that a sum not exceeding 2 millions of Spanish milled dollars be emitted in bills of credit for the defense of America. That language survives in the congressional broadside associated with Charles Thomson, Secretary of Congress, 1775. A national war would now be financed with a national promise, but not with national taxation, not with a federal customs service, not with a national executive that could compel payment, not with a stable redemption fund already in hand, just paper. And urgency. Here's what most people miss. The Continental dollar was not born corrupted by counterfeiting alone, or by abstract wartime inflation, or by some vague human weakness called greed. It was born into a structural contradiction. Congress could issue claims across the colonies. It could not reliably collect the resources needed to make those claims credible. And that changes the story, because money is not only printing, it is settlement. It is the answer to a hard question. When this note comes back, who must surrender something real? In 1775, that answer was political theater dressed as fiscal architecture. The colonies were pledged, but the extraction machinery was not. If you had taken one of those notes in Philadelphia in the summer of 1775, you were not really trusting ink. You were trusting that 13 jealous polities, already arguing over sovereignty, would later behave like one tax state, a dangerous assumption, and the street-level reality arrived early. Christopher Marshall, a Philadelphia merchant and diarist, would spend the war years recording what confidence looked like when it started to fray in daily trade. Not theory, not constitutional design, market life. Prices, refusals, evasion. That is where this story has to be read, not from the promise. From the moment the promise met bread. The break was constitutional before it was monetary. Congress could ask. It could not command. Under the system that hardened into the Articles of Confederation, the center had no direct power to tax individuals. It could requisition funds from the states. That is a softer word than the reality deserved. A requisition is not an extraction system. It is a request sent into a political negotiation, and requests fail differently than taxes fail. A tax has officers, deadlines, penalties, and seizure behind it. A requisition has delay, bargaining, excuses, and local priorities. During war, that difference is fatal, because Congress was spending on a continental scale while depending on 13 separate legislatures to refill the reservoir. Not one treasury. 13 moods. That is the mechanism. If you issue paper before you build a machine that can pull resources back in, the note stops being a settled claim and becomes a referendum on future cooperation. Every transaction carries a second question behind the first one. Not just, what is this worth today? But will the political system behind it still perform tomorrow? You can circulate that kind of promise for a while. You cannot stabilize it for long, and the forensic record is blunt on this point. The Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781 after years of wartime improvisation, explicitly preserved the sovereignty of each state while leaving Congress dependent on state contributions. Even before ratification, that logic was already operating. Congress was treated as the face of the war, but it was not yet the master of the revenue base. That sounds technical. It was not technical to the people living inside it. If you were a farmer deciding whether to part with grain, or a merchant deciding whether to release imported cloth, you were not evaluating an abstract republic. You were evaluating settlement risk. Could this paper later be redeemed through a functioning chain of public finance? Or were you being asked to fund the gap yourself? Christopher Marshall kept writing through this period in Philadelphia. He was not a theorist of monetary design. He was a merchant, watching trust become conditional. That is why his diary matters. It shows the system from ground level, where constitutional weakness stops sounding noble and starts sounding expensive. This is the inversion at the center of the story. The continental dollar did not first become weak because prices rose. Prices rose because the issuer behind the dollar was visibly weaker than the claims it had already put into circulation. Paper was not the foundation, political extraction was, and Congress did not have enough of it, so the note kept moving, but confidence moved faster. That is when the next layer of damage appears. Because Congress was not the only issuer, and once multiple papers begin competing inside a fragmented union, distrust no longer stays local. It starts crossing borders with the notes themselves. Congress was not alone in the paper business, and that made a bad design worse. The Continental notes moved across colonial lines, carrying the language of union. But the states were issuing paper too. Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, others besides, each under its own pressures, each with its own political timetable, each adding another layer of claims on the same pool of real goods. So now imagine the position of a seller, a wagon of flour, a shipment of rum, a bolt of cloth. You are not being offered one public money backed by one tax system. You are being offered overlapping promises from different authorities, with different redemption prospects crossing into one another's markets. The notes may look alike in function. They are not alike in credibility. That fragmentation corrodes pricing first, because once multiple issuers compete inside an unstable settlement order, you stop asking what the nominal face value says. You start discounting by origin, distance, rumor, and expected delay. A note from one jurisdiction is not the same thing as a note from another. A promise payable somewhere else is not payment. Not really. And that turns trade itself into a forensic exercise. Which paper? At what discount? Redeemable when? Accepted by whom? This is where official policy becomes revealing. As confidence weakened, authorities reached for compulsion. States passed legal tender laws. Legislatures and committees moved against those who rejected the notes or priced goods according to depreciation. In some places, critics of the currency were denounced as enemies of American liberty, or, in the harder phrasing that spread through the period, enemies of the credit itself. Notice the order of events. Belief weakens, coercion arrives, trust weakens further, because forced acceptance is not the same thing as willing settlement. You can order a note to be accepted at face value. You cannot force a butcher to forget what meat cost him tomorrow. You cannot force a merchant to ignore replacement cost. You cannot legislate away the fact that goods are finite and paper is multiplying. So sellers adapted, quietly at first, then openly. They raised nominal prices. They withheld stock. They preferred barter. They chose buyers more carefully. And the law interpreted that behavior as sabotage when much of it was simply self-defense. This is the part official histories often smooth over. The issue was never just inflation. It was a collision between paper promises and decentralized control over actual goods. The notes were legal. The goods were voluntary. And real goods always have the last vote. Christopher Marshall saw this in Philadelphia at the level that matters. Daily exchange. Not in congressional language, but in the stubborn behavior of markets. Refusals. Delays. Repricing. The long social unraveling that begins when everyone is still using the money. But fewer and fewer people believe it tells the truth. That is when governments usually learn the wrong lesson. They think circulation is confidence. It isn't. And when paper no longer buys provisions reliably, the next step is not monetary. It is physical. George Washington learned the monetary truth the hard way. An army does not live on theory. It lives on flour, beef, salt, shoes, wagons, and paper that no longer buys those things is not money to an army. It is delay. By the late 1770s, the commissary system was breaking under exactly that pressure. Suppliers hesitated. Contractors failed. Transportation faltered. Prices outran appropriations. Congress could still authorize notes. That did not mean those notes could still command provisions in the countryside. This is where monetary failure becomes state capacity failure. Washington's correspondence is full of that pressure, not in abstract complaints about inflation, but in repeated warnings that the army could not move, feed itself, or hold together without supplies that the paper system was failing to procure. Once voluntary exchange weakened, the line between purchase and seizure began to blur. Then it blurred completely. States and military authorities increasingly turned to impressment and requisition. Wagons, horses, cattle, grain. Taken with certificates, promises, or depreciating paper. Sometimes at stated prices, sometimes under direct compulsion. The language stayed administrative. The experience did not. If you were on the receiving end, the state had stopped buying and started taking. That is a regime change, and it tells you what money really is. Money is not a note the government says is valuable. Money is what allows the government to obtain resources without crossing immediately into coercion. When that bridge fails, force does the rest. But force is expensive too, because impressment does not restore trust. It consumes it. A farmer who sees neighbors paid in wheat paper or sees stock taken under authority does not become more willing next month. He hides inventory. He delays market entry. He protects what can still be protected. The visible supply shrinks. The state reads that as disloyalty. The population reads the state as predatory. Now the breakdown feeds itself. This is the buried mechanism under many paper collapses. The disaster is not just that prices rise. It is that the issuer loses the ability to convert nominal authority into voluntary access to real goods. At that point, every missing barrel and empty magazine becomes a fiscal document. Washington understood the consequence before Congress admitted it formally. A promise that cannot provision an army is already in default in the only currency that matters during war. Not dollars, bread, beef, distance, winter, and the formal admission was coming. Late, political, brutally honest in its arithmetic. The collapse was visible long before 1780. The March 1780 is when Congress stopped pretending otherwise. This is the distinction that matters. A currency does not truly die only when prices run away, or when people mock it in the street. It dies, in the forensic sense, when the issuer formally resets the promise at a fraction of the original claim. That is default made administrative. In March 1780, Congress adopted the scheme usually described through the 40-for-1 ratio. New notes would be issued, backed through state quotas, and the old Continental bills would be taken in at a devastating discount. The promise was no longer that one paper dollar would be honored as one. The promise was that the damage would be organized. That is different and worse, because now the issuer is not merely failing in practice. It is confessing in law. This is why the famous phrase, "not worth a Continental," catches only the mood, not the mechanism. The real event was not the joke. It was the settlement. A holder who had trusted the face value discovered, formally, that the political community would not retire that claim except at a severe loss. Nominal ownership survived on paper. Purchasing power did not. If you held the notes for wages, savings, or trade balances, the haircut was not theoretical. It was your life compressed. And notice what the arithmetic says about the whole episode. Congress had used the notes to mobilize resources in real time. Then, years later, it pushed the residual loss back onto holders through formal depreciation. The war had already consumed the goods. The paper holder inherited the bill. That is the buried lead. The inflation was the symptom the public could see. The default was the mechanism the issuer eventually admitted. And once that admission is made, recovery no longer comes from speeches, patriotic language, or stricter penalties. It comes only when the public sees a different kind of financial architecture, one tied to visible means of payment, narrower promises, and actual settlement strength. What restored credit was not optimism, it was structure. After the collapse, Men like Robert Morris pushed toward a narrower, harder answer to the problem Congress had failed to solve in 1775. Not more patriotic paper, not louder declarations, a financial instrument tied to visible resources, tighter discipline, and a clearer chain between promise and payment. The Bank of North America, chartered in 1781, mattered for that reason. So did Morris's insistence on specie credibility and enforceable finance. The lesson is not that metal is magical. It is that reassurance is not settlement. That is the modern parallel too. Not paper money exists, therefore history repeats. That is lazy. The real parallel is more dangerous. It appears when institutions make large promises, depend on fragmented political support, and lean on compulsory participation before they restore visible balance sheet strength. They ask you to trust first. They prove capacity later, sometimes much later. And that leaves you with the same binary choice people faced, in simpler language. In the era of the Continental, do you hold claims on a system because it tells you to feel calm? Or do you hold part of your life in forms that do not depend on official reassurance at the exact moment? Reassurance becomes policy. That does not mean panic. It does not mean prophecy. It does not mean romantic fantasies about gold coins buying bread on a battlefield. It means reading the mechanism honestly. A promise is only as good as the settlement power behind it. A note is only as strong as the issuer's ability to extract, redeem, and buy without force. And when a government creates money before it creates that machinery, the loss does not disappear. It travels, first through prices, then through trust, then through law, then through your life.